This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. Welcome to a Battle of Titans at the 2022 FIDE World Blitz Championship. Hikaru Nakamura with the white pieces faces Sasha Grischuk, one of the best Blitz players in the world, one of the top Grandmasters in the world. And I don't know about that opening choice. Grischuk starts the game off with a French. That is a dangerous opening to play in a Blitz game. But Hikaru, he doesn't respond with knight c3. He responds with the Tarrasch variation, which is, of course, one of the most reputable ways to beat the French. The knight situates itself on d2 rather than c3. Grischuk immediately strikes at the center. Hikaru captures the pawn on c5. That is a sideline. That's not a very well-known variation, and that triggered a relatively short think by Grischuk as he delays the recapture on c5. First, he focuses on forcing white to give up the rest of his pawn center. We have a trade on d5. Hikaru develops on f3, and Nakamura not really playing the opening all that ambitiously. I think Grischuk has already solved all of his problems as he recaptures the pawn on c5, both sides calmly continuing their development. White sending his bishop out to d3, potentially eyeing that h7 pawn after black castles kingside, and white is also very likely to castle kingside here as well. So both kings are going to be relatively safe for the foreseeable future. I think the battle is largely going to revolve around who can situate their minor pieces better and more harmoniously as Grischuk dials his queen back to c7. That is a very typical square for the queen in these types of variations. It's safe from all attacks by white's minor pieces, and I really like the way that Sasha is handling the opening as well as his clock. He's up 22 seconds, not something that you say every day about Alexander Grischuk. Hikaru pushes his pawn up to c3. I thought he might have wanted to play b3 and fianchetto his dark squared bishop. Instead, he moves the pawn up to c3 and vacates the c2 square for his queen. So the queen's going to move up to c2. White's going to build a battery against that h7 pawn. Now, Grischuk could play h6 whenever he wants to. So the position remaining pretty calm, and I jinxed him. He was up on time a move ago. He is now down on time, and I think that's where Grischuk feels the most comfortable. Is he going to play rook to d8 here and harass the d3 bishop? Well, that might be counterproductive because white can play queen c2, and that actually protects the bishop on d3. Instead, Grischuk focuses on completing the development of his minor pieces. He plays b6, saying, if you don't want a fianchetto, then I will. b6, preparing the fianchetto of his light squared bishop, and the knight on b8. In these types of French structures, it usually comes out to d7 in order to be able to jump later on to c5, and Hikaru continues to pressure the queenside. That's why he played a4 that early, in order to blast through the queenside and induce some weaknesses, but it has come at the cost of a pawn. Grischuk says, thank you very much, I'll take it. Hikaru says, give me that pawn back. Grischuk says no. He develops his knight to c6, and with his last move, knight d2 to b3, Hikaru has opened up a pathway for his dark squared bishop to develop itself nicely to g5, and both sides have finally completed their minor piece development. We are now officially in a very interesting positional middle game. Again, it's not about king safety here. Both kings are completely safe. It's about who can claim superiority on the queen side, and is Hikaru going to justify that positional pawn sacrifice on a5, and he's reaping the benefits of that sacrifice right now as he positions his knight on c5, trying to force black's light squared bishop back to its initial square. And if Grischuk decides to give that bishop up, then we're going to get an opposite colored bishop structure where white can position his bishop on e4. That's a pretty dominant square, and white's going to control light squares on both sides of the board. So a pretty unpleasant dilemma here for Alexander Grischuk. He might have underestimated the power of this knight jump to c5. The big question, is he going to keep his light squared bishop? No, he's not. He's going to play rook f8 to d8, and now the decision is in Hikaru's hands. He says, I'll take it. Knight takes b7, and now I think he's going to unpin his queen. Is he going to put it on e2, or is he going to put it on c2? Another big positional decision for Nakamura, and he decides on queen c2. And I think the reason is because this move comes with tempo. He attacks the pawn on h7. Grischuk has to honor that, and he does, but here comes the bishop. On to e4 it goes, and now you've got a mega pin. Not only is the knight pinned to the queen, now it's pinned to the rook, and Hikaru can continue playing with tempo by jumping his queen up to a4. So essentially, he can win the pawn back whenever he wants to, and he decides to do it right now. He gives his bishop up, but he wins the pawn on a5. He leaves Grischuk with a weak pawn on a7, which Hikaru continues to harass by doubling his rooks on the a-file. That bishop on f6 is also not very happy because it's biting on granite. It's staring at the pawn on c3. As we see Anish Giri there putting on his suit jacket. There's another game that catches his attention, but this game is about to heat up as Grischuk falls to a minute on the clock. He's slightly worse on the board. Black is still very solid. Everything's defended, but Hikaru loves these types of technical, grindy positions where he can play a million moves and keep his small advantage. You can see him there a very patient h3, building up his time advantage, building up the advantage on the board, and Grischuk trying to find the best way to coordinate his pieces and keep all of his bases covered. He can try to attack the b2 pawn, but Hikaru can defend it whenever he wants to by moving the rook up to a2. Instead, Grischuk, he says, I'm not happy on f6. I'm going to move my bishop over to b6. A very ingenious maneuver, and the bishop on b6 is actually going to be doing something. It's going to be pressuring the pawn on f2, and it's going to be protecting the d4 square, which otherwise could be used as an outpost for white's knight. Hikaru could play knight d4. Instead, he moves the rook up to a6. Very deliberate move there, and he pushes the pawn up to c4. Hikaru continuing to make claims on the queen side and continuing to expand. That pawn, it's currently restrained by black's pieces, but it's still a protected passer. The pawn on c4 could get really menacing if the queens are off the board, and Grischuk, determined that that won't happen, moves his queen up to c5, building a battery of his own against the f2 pawn and trying to keep white's queen at bay, and he moves the rook back to b8, a sign of anxiety there. Grischuk made that move pretty nervously. He continues to tick down on the clock, but Hikaru, he's got to find a way to keep tightening the screws. He's done a good job of it so far, but so is Grischuk, who moves his rook back to b8, and I think Grischuk is preparing to move the c8 rook over to d8 and try to get as many rooks off the board as possible. Hikaru says, be my guest. Hikaru's probably okay with a rook trade as well, because with every heavy piece that disappears from the board, the value of the pawn on c4 increases. So it's not entirely clear that trades of the rooks and trade of the queens favors black. And with 30 seconds on the clock, Grischuk just doesn't have time to burn on this decision. He moves his pawn up to a5, trying to find the optimal defensive arrangement on the queen side. Bishop back to a7. Great job by Grischuk there. He's moved his queen to an ideal square, both defensively and in terms of counterattacking the f2 pawn. Hikaru trying to find a way to stir the pot. He takes on d8. He decides to trade a pair of rooks, but the downside is that he has given up control of the d-file, and there are tactics in the air like rook d8 to d3. It's not really possible right now because the rook on e1 is defended, but it could be possible in the future. But Grischuk, he's down to 15 seconds. Bishop up to b6. Supporting the pawn on a5, inviting Hikaru to move his own rook up to e5 and knock that queen away. First, Hikaru expands on the king side, h4, setting the preconditions for a potential attack. Oh, and that is a risky move. That is a risky move by Grischuk as Magnus Carlsen comes to observe the game. There might be a sacrifice on g6. There might be a sack on f7. I don't know about that last move. Grischuk uses his king. That's like a goalkeeper coming out to kick the corner kick. He uses his king to defend the pawns, but Hikaru drops the knight back to f3. And the problem is that that knight is going to head to g5, and that's going to create a host, a litany of threats on the king side. When the 8 seconds on the clock, I don't know if Grischuk is going to be able to keep all of his bases covered. There goes the knight. On to g5 it goes. 5 seconds for Grischuk. He moves his queen up to f6, and it's met with a brilliant move. Rook to e3, threatening rook f3. Grischuk has a second. He's got to move, and he makes the move just in time, but he's blundered rook takes e6. He's blundered rook takes e6, and he pays the price for giving away the g5 square, but Hikaru doesn't play it. Instead, he goes rook f3, and with 1 second on the clock, rook takes f7. That's an alternate win. If rook f7, the knight captures on e6 and wins black's queen. What a positional effort by Hikaru Nakamura as he wins an impressive game. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to click the link in the playlist for more of these Blitz videos. Thank you so much for watching.